Hello everyone. For this video recording, I'm going to explain how the spinal cord processes the sensory input and the motor output, therefore the sensory and the motor stimuli. Therefore, with regards to the spinal nerves, there are actually 31 pairs, and these are going to be named for the level of the spinal cord at which each one will emerge from. So there are going to be 8 pairs of cervical nerves, and these are going to be designated C1 through C8. There are going to be 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, and these are going to be designated for T1 through T12. There are going to be 5 pairs of lumbar nerves that are going to be designated L1 through L5, and 5 pairs of sacral nerves that are designated S1 through S5. And at the end, we have 1 pair of coccygeal nerves. Now pay attention to the number of nerves. Remember we had, for the sacrum, it's made up of 5 fused vertebrae. Therefore, we have S1 through S5. For the lumbar vertebrae, remember we had 5. Therefore, the nerves are L1 through L5. Thoracic vertebrae, we had 12. Therefore, they're numbered T1 through T12. But remember that the cervical vertebrae, we only had 7. And here we have the cervical nerves that are numbered C1 through C8. So we have an extra nerve. And this is because the first nerve is going to be located between the atlas and the occipital bone. And the last cervical nerve is going to be located below the 7th cervical vertebrae. Therefore, we have one above the first vertebrae and one below the last cervical vertebrae that will be considered cervical nerves. Therefore, we have 8 cervical nerves. And all of these will total, like I said, 31 spinal nerves. Now, these spinal nerves, once they leave the spinal cord, they will extend outward from the vertebral column to be able to innervate the periphery. And the nerves in the periphery, they're not going to be straight continuations of the spinal nerves, but they're rather going to be reorganized. So they're going to come together and then they will branch out again. And these will give rise to specific nerves that are going to follow a different pathway. Now the axons from the different spinal nerves, they will come together into what we call a systemic nerve. And this occurs at 4 places along the length of the vertebral column. And each of these systemic nerves are going to be identified as nerve plexuses. Therefore, the word plexus is going to be used to describe this network of nerve fibers that are going to come together, but they will have no associated cell bodies. So it's just the axons of the neurons that are coming together and not the neuronal cell body. And there are 4 different plexuses. 2 are going to be branching off from the cervical level, and 1 will come from the lumbar level, and 1 will come from the sacral level. The 2 that come from the cervical level are going to be the cervical plexus and the brachial plexus. And the one that's coming from the lumbar level is going to be called the lumbar plexus, which makes sense. And the one that's coming from the sacral level is going to be called the sacral plexus. Let's start with the first one, which is the cervical plexus. It's going to be composed of axons from the spinal nerves that go from C1 through C5. And it's actually only part of C5 that forms the cervical plexus. And in this plexus, it will innervate several structures. We have it innervating areas of the head, neck, and chest. And these are going to be parts of the skin that it will innervate. It can innervate muscles, and these have to do with the larynx. But the main one that I really want you to know that will be important, that originates from the cervical plexus, is the phrenic nerve. So the phrenic nerve, it's going to be important because it will provide sensory information to the diaphragm, which is a muscle. So it will receive that sensory input if the diaphragm needs to contract or if the diaphragm needs to relax to be able to help with respiration. So again, the phrenic nerve is the only nerve that I need you to know that originates from the cervical plexus. And out of the 8 cervical nerves that form the cervical plexus, the ones that will form the phrenic nerve are C3 through C5. Now, if we were to look at the lab model and try to identify the cervical plexus, we would be able to mainly look at this side over here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These will come together to form the cervical plexus. On this side, we're actually missing a nerve over here. So it's not that we don't have the nerve, it's that the model doesn't show the nerve. So we would have an extra one over here. So C1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. These form the cervical plexus. And notice how you have a nerve that's coming down over here. And this nerve will be the nerve that will innervate the diaphragm, which is located between the thoracic and the abdominal cavity. Next, we have what we call the brachial plexus, which will also originate mainly from the cervical region. So part of C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1 will come together to form the brachial plexus. Now remember that we had part of C5 forming the cervical plexus. So the other part will form the brachial plexus, and then we have 4 more nerves, which are C6, 7, 8, and T1. Now these nerves, when they're close to the spinal cord, we call them roots. And these roots, they will come together at some point right over here at this region, and then they will branch out again, and they will form what we call trunks. The trunks will then come together and then branch out again and form what we call an anterior and a posterior division. And then these divisions will come together and form what we call the cords. And the cords will branch out and come together and form what we call the nerves or the branches. Therefore, let's see what happens. So C5 and C6 are going to come together to form what we call the superior trunk. C7 by itself will form the middle trunk, and C8 and T1 will come together to form what we call the inferior trunk. So if you have a superior trunk, you're going to have an inferior trunk. And then the one in the middle is called the middle trunk. And these will come together to form what we call 3 anterior divisions, which are these 3 over here, and then 3 posterior divisions. And these divisions will then come together to form the cords. We're going to have 3 main cords. One that's going to be the lateral cord. If we have a lateral, we have a medial. And then one that's going to be the posterior cord. And we don't have an anterior cord. And the reason why we don't have an anterior cord is because the lateral and the medial are actually located anteriorly. And therefore, the superior trunk, the middle trunk, and the inferior trunk will come together to form a posterior cord, which will be located posteriorly on our body. And then the lateral cord, which runs lateral on our body, so it will run laterally over here, will give rise to 2 branches or 2 nerves, which are the muscular cutaneous nerve and the median nerve. Now the median nerve will also be formed by the medial cord that comes together with the lateral cord, form the median nerve. Then we have the posterior cord, which will give rise to 2 branches or 2 nerves, which are the axillary nerve and the radial nerve. And then the medial cord will come together to give rise to the ulnar nerve by itself, but remember, it also came together with the lateral cord to form the median nerve. Now, a few things that you guys get confused with is with regards to the median nerve and the medial cord. But remember, if we have a lateral cord, we have a medial cord. So AL. Therefore, the other one is what we call the median nerve. And here I have a little mnemonic for you to be able to use with regards to how the roots become the trunk, which then becomes these subdivisions, which then becomes the cord, which then becomes the branches. So roots, trunks, divisions, cords, branches, or real Texans drink cold beer. Now, the lumbar and the sacral plexuses, they sometimes are collectively referred to as the lumbosacral plexus, just because both of them will arise from the end of the spinal cord, and they will supply the nerves for the pelvis and the lower limbs. So sometimes they're referred collectively again as the lumbosacral plexus. But these will give rise to important nerves, which are the femoral nerve, the saphenous nerve, the sciatic nerve, tibial nerve, and the common fibular nerve, just to mention the most important ones. But notice how they are originating over here in the lumbar region, in this case, and these are originating in the sacral region. Now this image I think is very important for us to understand that these nerves that we're talking about, they will contain both sensory and motor input. How is that possible? Well, look at this model over here. We're going to have, this will be the posterior side or the dorsal side, and this is the anterior side. How do I know this? Well, we have this structure over here, which we talked about already, which is the dorsal root ganglion. And notice how there's a tiny little purple structure over there, which represents the cell body of this sensory neuron that's arriving from the sensory input, so the receptor side. The cell body stays here in the dorsal root ganglion, and then it comes to the spinal cord, where it will synapse with another neuron, which is called the interneuron, that will then sometimes synapse with another neuron and then exit the spinal cord as a motor information. So once they exit, they have motor information going out. So you're going to have sensory information coming in, motor information coming out, and this whole structure over here represents a spinal nerve. So that's why we can say that the spinal nerves will contain both motor and sensory information. Now, another thing that I want you to notice is the morphology of these neurons. So notice how this neuron over here that has the cell body in the dorsal root ganglion has a very long dendrite, a cell body, and then a long axon with terminal button. So this morphology is the morphology of this neuron that we talked about. Therefore, the cell body is located outside of the central nervous system, so outside of the spinal cord. Therefore, is part of the peripheral nervous system, and it's the unipolar or pseudo-unipolar type of neuron. And this other neuron over here is what we call the multipolar neuron. Notice how the cell body and the dendrites are close together. So this is what it's representing. And then it has an axon with the terminal button that will synapse with another neuron that has the cell body and the dendrites close together. So again, a multipolar neuron with then a long axon, which is what we see over here. So what will differentiate if it's unipolar or a pseudo-unipolar from a multipolar is the fact that the cell body of this one is located very far from the dendrites, which will be at the receptor. And this one over here, which is a multipolar, the cell body and the dendrites are located very close to each other. And the last type of neuron that you need to know is the bipolar, which is located more in special senses. And this type of neuron we will cover when we talk about the special senses. And on this image, this is a sensory input. It sends the information down this afferent fiber with the cell body in the dorsal root ganglion. It synapses with an interneuron, which will synapse with another motor neuron and send the input for the muscle to contract and remove your hand from what's causing this injury. Here we have an image of the peripheral nerves that are mapped out in this layout that's called a dermatome. So a dermatome is going to be defined as these areas of the skin on your body that will be able to rely on specific nerve connections on your spine or your spinal cord. So in this way, the dermatomes, they're much like a map. So you can see from this image that they have mapped out which nerve will be innervating which part of your skin. And this is important because you're able to verify which nerve is damaged by knowing where in the skin these nerves will be innervating. So for example, if you have pain in this area right over here, you know that this is innervated by L1. Therefore, you know that the nerve is being damaged in this location.